Hey, welcome to another time of meeting together. This is our Boston.NET Boston.NET architecture group. Let me get it right. And this is Robert Hurlbut, and we have tonight Isaac Levin speaking to us. He has visited with us before and spoken to us before, but a number of years ago in person. And this is a very timely topic. What do I do with my old .NET Framework apps? And really looking forward to it. So thank you again, Isaac. Turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Robert. And thanks everybody for checking it out, whether you're watching right now or you're watching this in the future times. So like Robert said, my name is Isaac Levin. I'm a .NET developer advocate at a small company called AWS. And my whole job is around talking about .NET with people who love talking about .NET. And if you like this particular session that we're putting together and you want to kind of follow around what I'm doing in the .NET space, you can follow me on Twitter or Twitch or GitHub. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin. I also have a podcast called Coffee and Open Source where I interview people all across the tech landscape. I've interviewed a handful of folks that your audience might know, or you folks might know. Like I've interviewed Scott Hanselman, Kelsey Hightower, Liz Fong Jones, who is an expert in the observability space, as well as a bunch of other people. I'm doing it for 2 or 3 years now. So Coffee and Open Source, it's available on all of the different podcast providers, and the videos on YouTube. And then finally, I am the marketing chair of the .NET Foundation. So if you have any thoughts about the foundation or want to reach out to me more about how you can be a part of the foundation, please let me know and we'll get you plugged into the areas that you find passion for. So with that, that's my little spiel intro. Thanks so much for putting up with it. We're going to talk today about what do I do with my old .NET Framework applications. And Robert mentioned it's kind of timely. So this recording, November 16th of 2022, about a week after .NET Conf, where another version of .NET comes out, right? And if you've been following along, .NET has changed a lot. And let's talk a little bit about, where we were with .NET and how we've got and where we are right now and how we've gotten there. So I think the first thing to call out is, why .NET 7, which, as it shipped in last week, so early November of 2022. Why is it a valuable choice to build applications on? So for one, the .NET framework or the .NET ecosystem that we now know it today is cross-platform. It runs basically anywhere. So it can run still on Windows, like traditional .NET Framework apps. It can run on Mac, it can run on Linux. I have a TV in my living room, a Samsung TV that actually runs .NET as well. You can put it on your watches or any phones. And it's really been built from the ground up to provide a amazing experience for developers. And the reason why it's done that is providing tons of performance and productivity improvements and allows us to build applications in a more cloud native or cloud ready perspective. And we're going to go through some of the real values of .NET 7 in general, or .NET in general, in a bit. But I wanted to just give you kind of one little here why you should be choosing .NET 7. But let's talk about how we've gotten to this point. So you're probably familiar with if you're looking at the 3 boxes on the left-hand side of the screen, you're looking at .NET Framework. So that is, 20 plus years of development. .NET Framework, it's 20 plus years old now, which is crazy to think. And at a particular point in time, that was the way that we built .NET applications. And it ran on Windows because it was deeply rooted ties to the GAC and IIS and these sort of things. And entire companies, entire enterprises have built on the back of .NET to really bring value to their customers and bring value to their business. It's at a particular point in time, a handful of years ago, there was an awareness from the open source community that, hey, .NET is great, C# is great, but you can only run on Windows. Let's build a non-Windows version of .NET. And that was called the Mono Runtime. And that was created by a handful of .NET developer community champions. And that company, or those group of individuals, created a company called Xamarin. That company called Xamarin was eventually purchased by another company called Microsoft. And we'll get to that in a second. But at that point, we had the .NET framework, which was completely owned and managed by Microsoft. And then we had a cross-platform implementation of .NET, which was created by the open source community. And Microsoft saw all of the great traction, all the great momentum that was being built with the mono runtime, and thought we should start looking at opportunities to create a cross-platform version of .NET. And that was shipped a handful of years ago in the moniker of .NET Core. And then after .NET Core ships and after Xamarin is acquired by Microsoft, Microsoft now has 3 .NETs at this particular time. So what do we do with all those .NETs? Well, I think the way that you probably, if you've been paying attention to the news or you just understand how things work, let's merge it all together and call it .NET. And that's what we have this .NET 7 wave, that thing that I mentioned a bit earlier about all the great capabilities, the best of breed from Windows platform, the best of breed from the mono runtime, and the best of breed from the things that have been happening in .NET Core. What does that actually mean? So the most important thing to call out is there are some subtle differences between .NET Framework and .NET Core and Mono, right? If you are building .NET Framework applications today, there are no new features that are coming to .NET Framework, only security fixes, only bug patching, things like that. But the one thing that I want folks to be aware of is that if you are building .NET Framework apps today, and those .NET Framework apps are in the latest version of .NET Framework, which is 4.8.1 at the time of this recording, you have support. So it's really, really important to call out that even though .NET Framework is quote unquote legacy, it ships in Windows today. And because of the fact that it's in Windows, you're always going to get support for it. So don't think that you have to be on the latest versions of .NET because you're building an app in .NET Framework 4.8.1 and it's there, you can rest assured that you're going to get that support and you can continue bringing value to your business. But if you have the opportunity to go to newer versions of .NET and really take advantage of some of the amazing capabilities of .NET, we should be looking to do that for greenfield development specifically. So I mentioned .NET Core a little bit ago, and the latest version of .NET Core to this point is 3.1. And when this was a few years ago, when Microsoft was putting together kind of the roadmap for what's next with .NET Core 3.1, they ran into an interesting dilemma. The next version of .NET Core would be 4.0. And I'd imagine that a lot of folks on this call and folks that are watching realize that there's probably some concern there. If I go to Google or Bing or whatever my favorite search engine is, and I type in .NET 4 and then some question, you're going to get stuff from .NET Framework and stuff from the newer version of .NET. And that's problematic as it pertains to trying to triage or trying to find the answers to our problems. Microsoft also recognized, hey, we own this asset called Mono, and there's been amazing innovations in this space, especially around ahead of time compiling and other things. We should take the best of that and combine it with .NET Core, and that's what the .NET team of Microsoft did. And they merged it into the same code base as .NET Core, and that became .NET 5. They dropped the core from the nomenclature because they understood now there's one .NET. When I search for .NET, not .NET Core, .NET Framework, or whatever, it's just .NET going forward. And so .NET 5 was released in November of 2020, so about 2 years ago. And how this works is that every year in November timeframe, there will be a new version of .NET. And now that goes to .NET 6, which shipped in November of last year, and then last week, .NET 7. But let's talk a little bit about these versionings and how it means as it pertains to support. The biggest thing that I want folks to take away from this is that if you have an even number of .NET, so .NET 4, .8 in that particular case, .NET 6, or .NET that ships next year, those are all what we like to call LTS, or long-term support, which means that you get 3 years of support from the launch of the version. So in this particular case, .NET 6 is the latest LTS of .NET, and that will have support until the end of 2024. So because it was shipped last year in 2021. Odd numbers are a bit different. They have what's called STS, or standard term support. And what that means is that they get 18 months from launch. So theoretically, .NET 5 actually out of support now. .NET 7 will be out of support in middle of 2024 timeline. But by that particular point in time, .NET 8 will be out. And we can rest assured that the process to migrate from .NET 7 to .NET 8 will probably not be that challenging, because previous versions of .NET have been easier than in the past to migrate. For instance, going from .NET 6 to .NET 7 it's a very trivial process in a lot of cases. Not saying that it's easy in every case, but for most cases, it's pretty straightforward. But when it comes to building .NET 7, we need to consider what's not in .NET 7 applications. So if you've been building .NET Framework apps for a while, there are probably some particular ways you are component types that you've built that no longer are supported technically. And those are web forms, WCF, for instance, are the two main ones that people talk to me about. However, even though there's no plans to port these type of component models to .NET 7, there are suitable replacements that have been recommended by the .NET team at Microsoft. For instance, web forms, if you like the feel of building apps in a web form style with a code behind and all those sort of things, a great suitable replacement is ASP.NET Core Blazor, which, if you're not familiar, gives you a lot of great experiences. One primary being is that you can write C# code that actually runs in the browser natively. So you no longer have to rely on JavaScript frameworks to be able to give you Web 2.0 experiences. You still can build those experiences using JavaScript, and there is interop between them, but it just gets you the ability to write C# anywhere, which is really exciting. And then the second primary one for web or API-based workloads is WCF Server. And if you built applications with WCF Server, you might like the way that that's structured and like the performance that goes into having server-to-server communication, server-to-server discovery. So that's a replacement recommended by the .NET team is gRPC. So gRPC is a technology. RPC stands for Remote Procedure Call, and it gives you that same similar experience. However, in comparison to, it's a different protocol. So instead of sending JSON or XML over the wire, it sends binary data, and it's actually 7 to 10 times faster than REST gRPC is. So one thing to consider, it gives you great performance increases. But if you still really want to build WCF style apps, there is a community project that's been created, and Microsoft contributes heavy to it, AWS contributes heavy to it, and it's one of those things where even though it's not officially supported, quote unquote, we see that there's tons of opportunity from all the great work in the developer community to bring value in that particular way. So two options if you want to go WCF route, or if you want to use gRPC. Hopefully that makes sense for everybody. And if you have any questions during this, feel free to throw them in the chat, and I'll stop and pause and answer them if needed. The biggest, I guess, one of the biggest changes that we have going from how we go about thinking about building .NET applications, .NET Framework applications, and .NET 7 applications is now we have a more simplified framework of target frameworks that we want to be able to utilize when we're building applications, because now it just doesn't run on Windows. It can run on Android or iOS or Mac or Tizen TVs or Samsung watches or what have you, right? So the .NET team decided that it was good to have a simplified framework or simplified target framework for all the different ways that we can publish apps to. And what was landed on was .NET 7.0 in this particular case, .NET 7. So this code that runs basically anywhere, .NET 7 code that runs anywhere. So, and that replaces the best of .NET Core 3.1, which is Net Core App, that's the framework name for that, and Net Standard, which is the framework name for .NET Standard, and we'll talk about .NET Standard in a second. And then after that, if you need to light up specific OS functionality, like things in Windows or Android or iOS, you then provide what's called a TFM, or a Target Framework Moniker. And how you do that is you specify your target framework, in this case .NET 7.0, and then you add that platform particular keyword, so Windows or Android or iOS. And what you see here is just a graphical way of that, right? So everything on the bottom, that light blue or that long bar at the bottom, so net x.y, that is the acclamation of Net Core App 3.1, which I said is .NET Core, and Net Standard 2.1, which is .NET Standard 2.1. And then after that, if you need particular OS features or OS functionality, those four boxes a little bit above the longer box on the bottom, dash Windows, dash Android, dash iOS, dash whatever, that's how you'll get that specific OS functionality that you're needed to build your applications. When we're building our applications, though, what sort of libraries that Microsoft builds, what are those libraries going to target? So I think the biggest thing to call out, and this column needs to get updated. This setting is .NET 7.0 now. I just didn't update it, unfortunately. your cross-platform libraries, so ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework, basically everything the system.name namespace, so system.link, system.collection.generic, all of those libraries and most libraries really are going to be net 7.0. So don't worry about the 6.0, no, it's 7.0. If you need to build specific capabilities for Windows, like you're building WinForms apps, PF apps, manage GWP, net 6.0 or net 7.0 - Windows. And then going down the line, if you're building cross-platform things like Xamarin Forms, Maui, Net 7.0 - whatever your particular OS flavor is or target flavor that you need to specify. And then finally, if you're building applications that need to be called, or building libraries that need to be called by other .NET Framework and .NET applications, like SQL.data.client or Microsoft.data.SQL client, for instance, look forward to .NET Standard 2.0. But what should you target when you're building your applications? So if you, like I mentioned a bit earlier, if you have an application that, or you have a library that has a is a dependency for a .NET Framework application or a .NET 6 or 7 application, use .NET Standard 2.0. And what .NET Standard is the best way to summarize it. It is a specification or contract of a lot of APIs. So the APIs that I mentioned earlier, system.collections.generic, system.link, what have you, right? All those namespaces that we put at the top in our using statements, all of those are now available in a cross-platform implementation called .NET Standard. And there have been different versions of .NET Standard. And how it works is the higher the number of the version of .NET Standard, the more APIs that you have access to. But the downside to that, or I guess the gotcha of it, is the higher the number, the less supporting platforms. So for instance, if you were to go from .NET Standard 1.6 to .NET Standard 2.0, there's more APIs in 2.0, but there's less surface area from a supported project. So maybe Windows 8 doesn't have support or something like that. And there's also .NET Standard 2.1, which basically allows you to add code or have some of the experience that are available in the Mono and Xamarin runtimes and .NET Core 3.1. It's less relevant for .NET 6 and 7, but it is something to consider if there are some APIs there that you need access to. But if you're building applications today and you just want to use the latest and greatest, Net 6.0 or Net 7.0 is for that code sharing moving forward. So that's what you should be targeting your projects with. Hopefully that makes sense. And I know you're probably thinking we've been here for 15, 20 minutes. I've talked even like a .NET history lesson, right? I've kind of gone ad nauseum over how we've gotten to this particular point and why we're here and all these sort of things. And the title of this talk is, what do I do with my own .NET Framework applications? And I think at this particular point in time, it's good to kind of talk about what I recommend when I talk to customers about a workflow or a set of guidelines that we should use when we're looking at upgrading our .NET Framework to .NET 6 or .NET 7. And that first step is this preparation step, I like to call it. So at the end of the day, it's really, really important to have an idea of what you're doing before you start doing it, right? So if you have a large solution with hundreds of projects potentially, you want to get a really good assessment of all the NuGet packages that come into play, loose binaries if you're referencing DLLs on disk or different front-end dependencies or .NET Framework APIs you're using. You want to build some catalog of information that you can go, okay, this particular solution, it's going to take this amount of effort because look at all these different dependencies that are going to get updated. And there are some great tools for that. There's the porting assistant for .NET from AWS, which is a free and open source tool on GitHub that allows you to do that. There's also the .NET Upgrade Assistant, which is a command line based utility from the .NET team at Microsoft that allows you to build a rich report. And we'll take a look at what those experiences look like in a second. But once you've gotten that really solid report and that really solid understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, you can then use the porting system for .NET, for instance, to actually take off some of the low-hanging fruit and port your project from .NET Framework whatever to .NET 6. And there's a standalone version of the porting system that allows you to really get a great experience in there. But the biggest thing to consider is that more than likely after running that porting command, your code will not build, more than likely. So then you can go into your favorite editor like Visual Studio and attempt to build your code. So looking for warnings in their list and looking for NuGet package references that might not be compatible anymore and things like that. One thing to call out too that's really important on step 2 is that you don't want to do this in a place that's going to potentially block yourself in the future or block your teammates in the future. So one thing that I always recommend is if you're looking down this exercise, spin up a new branch, call it upgrade or something like that. And then within there, you can do all that work, and then you can throw away the branch if needed, or you can go back to a branch. So if you need to ship features for your work or bug fixes, you're not blocked because you're in this state that your app doesn't build, right? But at the end of the day, let's say you're past step 3 and your code builds. Then the next step, obviously, is to running and testing it, making sure that your test projects have full code coverage, as well as our .NET 7 or .NET 6 as well. There might not be changes that are apparent until runtime. So making sure that your application runs well locally, deploying it up to an environment, maybe a test environment or a staging environment, and making sure everything works the way that you're expected before you go ahead and make that push to production. And if you have the capability, maybe try on some blue-green deployment, where you can actually then balance traffic for people. Some people are getting the newer version, some people are getting the more legacy version, and then see what the experiences are like between the two and the performance in there. Well, what actually needs to get rewritten versus reused? So this is always an interesting conversation, because initially it could be really, I guess, overwhelming to think about, okay, I have 40 or 60 or 80 project solution. There's a lot of code in there. But I can tell you right now, most of that code is code you can reuse. If you have a specific business logic or identity information, or you're using ASP.NET MVC, so your controllers, your views, your models, most of that stuff can get reused. If you're going against some data source, more than likely that code can be used. And what I like to recommend is start taking that code out of your .NET Framework projects and putting them into .NET Standard libraries. And then at a particular point in time, you run out of code that is .NET Framework dependent. And at that point in time, you might have to rewrite a lot of that. So for instance, some gotchas are like the ASP.NET startup code, right? In the new versions of .NET, there isn't a global ASAX file, and you don't have to register modules or and things like that. There's also no bundling and minification built in the past. So if you're using things like that, you probably have to come up with some other option to do that. Also things like configuration manager aren't there in the way that you would expect them in .NET 7. There's a more streamlined, I guess you could say, seamless approach for configuration in newer versions of .NET. So definitely take a look at some of that documentation. And I'll provide a link at the end to all sorts of stuff that hopefully will be helpful for folks. But at the end of the day, the stuff that you actually have to rewrite isn't as much as you think it is. It just seems like a lot because you have a lot of stuff going on in that project. But if you can extract all that, I guess, non-.NET Framework dependent code to class libraries, you'll find out pretty quickly, oh, I don't have a lot of stuff in here that's like dependent on Windows or depending on IIS or depending on .NET Framework. So that's I guess some tricks of the trade, I guess you could say, for what we can do there. And let's talk a little bit more about tools that can help us get there. Like I mentioned a bit earlier, the porting system for .NET from AWS, there's a standalone tool as well as a Visual Studio extension for 2019-2022. This is a completely free tool. You don't have to be an AWS customer to use it. You have to have an AWS account to use it. You don't have to have any relationship with AWS at all to use this tool. It's available open source on GitHub, and you can download the executable as well from the AWS website. It supports .NET Framework 3.5 and can help port your application all the way to .NET 6. .NET 7 is coming very, very soon, but right now it's just .NET 6 because that's the long-term support version. It also does .NET Core 3.1, which is also LTS. Currently, it supports MVC projects, class libraries, and it will actually port your applications from WCF to Core WCF, because at AWS, we recognize that Core WCF there has a release version. It's past 1.0. So we see it, and we've had customers that are using it currently in production. So what that means to us is that it's a viable alternative for folks that are looking to go from WCF. And there's some really other interesting things that are coming in the near term, like talking about converting web forms applications to Blazor applications and things that we're trying to do in that space. So I'll provide a link to the porting assistant at the end of this talk, and we can take a look at some of the cool things that are coming in the future, and you can follow along. So with that, I wanted to actually go through and do a demo of some of the tools that we can use to make our lives more effective. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize here. I'm going to spin up Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to show two tools. I'm going to show the .NET Upgrade Assistant, which, like I mentioned, is a command line based utility from the .NET team at Microsoft. And then I'm going to show you the porting assistant as well. So with this particular application that I have open in Visual Studio Code, this is a simple WinForms application. And I can validate that by opening this up and going to the CS proj. Let's just minimize this. And as you can see here, it is 4.5, right? So this project in particular, it's a WinForms project, like I mentioned. It calls into a class library, which also is .NET Framework 4.5. And what I want to be able to do is I want to take this application and I want to port it from .NET Framework 4.5 to the latest versions of .NET using the .NET Upgrade Assistant. And how do I do that? So as you can see here, I'm inside of this directory, the solution directory for a particular project. And all I have to do is I can run a simple command. So Upgrade Assistant, which is a .NET Global tool, and then I run the upgrade command, and then I specify the solution file. And then what it's going to do is it's going to start walking through all of the steps that are going to need to take place to take our app from .NET Framework 4.5 to .NET 6, and it walks it through in an interactive fashion. So the first thing that's going to want to do, detects our project. It detects that there's multiple entry points for our project. It says previous entry point, and then it provides those lists of entry points. Entry points just being projects. So I say I want my entry point to be the matching game, which is our WinForms application. I specify that, and then it's going to then mention, oh, you want to upgrade this particular project. So I say, sure. But then it says, there is a better recommended order in this case to actually upgrade your project. So let's start with the logic project, which is a class library. So I say, sure. And then it gives me a huge list of things that it needs to do to get this application from .NET Framework 4.5 to .NET 6. And the first thing that it wants to do is back up a project. In this particular case, I don't back up projects. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip that. And then the next thing it's going to do is it wants to clean up all of our NuGet package references and then update the target framework, the TFM, like I mentioned earlier. So it's going to convert that project to that SDK style. And if I actually open this up in Visual Studio Code, I can actually see the changes that have taken place. So let's minimize this. So on the left-hand side, we have a 49-line project file, and that's what it was before. Now it's simplified, like I mentioned earlier, it's 11. It's not done yet, so the target framework is still .NET 4.5. But as we go through this process, it's going to update this file more and more. So let's actually do that. So the next thing that it's going to do is it's going to start adding reference analyzers to our project. And what a reference analyzer does is it basically adds a project, a NuGet project, or NuGet package to your project. And that project or those NuGet packages basically have a lot of conditional checking. Oh, you're doing this, you need to do this. You're doing this, we need to port this. So let's go ahead and add those in there. So we're going to add that project in there. And then the next thing it's going to want to do is going to want to update the TFM. So let's go ahead and do that. It's going to then say, you upgrade your TFM applied successfully. So upgrade the TFM to .NET Standard 2.0. And we can see that here on this right-hand side. So if I go back, the next thing that it's going to want to do after it updates the TFM, after it adds some more analyzers, it's then going to move on to the next project. So let's do that. And then it's just as simple as, okay, so you've done one project, let's do the next project. So in this particular case, it's that WinForms application. So there's a bit more that's going to be involved here. But the process is still the same. I'm still backing up my project. I'm still converting it to that project style, that going from that project file to that SDK style approach. So we'll do that. And then it's going to add those analyzers, like I mentioned earlier, and then it's going to update the TFM again. So let's add those analyzers and let's update that TFM. And then we can hop over to Visual Studio Code and take a look at this. So minimizing or collapsing that pane. So this is our WinForms application project. So it went from 89 lines to 89 lines. That's weird, right? So let's actually minimize this. Let's don't save. I click on the wrong one. Yeah, there we go. So I clicked on the wrong one. Sorry about that. So we went from 89 lines to 19 lines. And if you go up to the top, it says .NET 6.0 - Windows now, because this is a WinForms application, so you need to light up Windows specific capabilities. And I'm going to continue to go through this process, and it's going to then do more and more checks. So we'll check for Windows compatibility, because new versions of Windows require things like high DPI and other things like that. So we need to make sure that our WinForms applications have that stuff built into them. So we're going to need to update our desktop projects, which it does here. We're going to add that default font API alert. And I'm just going to skip over a couple of these because the biggest one is at the bottom where it starts to update our source code, which is kind of cool. The next step it's going to do some WinForms updater to update step. So what that does is that adds some code for a high DPI setting. So, and we'll take a look at what that looks like in a second. And then the last thing that it's going to do is it's going to update our desktop project, and then it's going to update that source code like I mentioned earlier. So waiting for this to funnel through all the steps that it can do. So it runs those analyzers, identifies those diagnostics in the project, and then we should be all the way green, right? And then we move on to this next project, but there's no more new projects, right? So now we just finalize the upgrade. Yay, so we're done, right? So what are the things that actually change, right? So if you take a look, it made changes to those project files, but it also made changes to our program.cs. So we added a line for setting high DPI mode, because in the new versions of Windows, like I mentioned, we need to have high DPI set. So let's do this. So I'm in that project again, or I'm in that solution. Let's go into the project. And if I do .NET run, which is the command line utility to run a .NET 6 or .NET 7 application, there you go. A WinForms application that was 4.5 7 minutes ago is now a .NET 6 application. And as you can see here, everything is working as expected. It's just a simple matching game. There's nothing really exciting about this particular project, but it shows you that you can do these things if you use the right tools in the right way to be effective. So let's actually close out of this and take a look at another tool. And that tool is the porting assistant for .NET. So what is the porting assistant for .NET? So again, this is built by employer, AWS. It's free to use, no AWS commit, no AWS account required, right? All it is it provides, again, similar to the upgrade assistant, a graphical interface, but it provides, instead of the upgrade assistant, it provides a graphical interface to go through some of these steps. And before I started this talk, I actually assessed some projects. So I assessed 2 projects here. The first one we'll take a look at is Nope Commerce. So if you haven't heard of NOP Commerce, basically what it is it's a open source e-commerce platform that's available on GitHub. So for instance, if you have a business and you want an e-commerce solution, you can actually go out to GitHub, clone this repository, and use it as inspiration to build the e-commerce experience for your business. However, when I assess this particular project, which has 31, or this particular solution, which has 31 projects in it, I get a bunch of really, really interesting information. So I can find out how many incompatible NuGet packages this solution has, how many incompatible APIs, and then I can look down at all these individual projects and get breakdowns of what type of version of the .NET framework they are, and reference projects and porting actions that are needed to take place. But there's one cool thing as well. I can look at project references, and it'll show me a graphical interface of all the interdependencies between my solutions. So I can then take a look at something like this and say, which project should I like to upgrade first? Probably not this one, because that's going to break literally every project in the process. Maybe do one that is a bit lighter touch. But again, just this graphical interface is extremely valuable for folks, because the interconnectivity between all of our projects in a .NET solution is pretty intensive sometimes. So that's really important to call out. But let's actually take a look at one of these projects. So let's go to the NOP core project, for instance. And then it lists out all the NuGet packages that I have in particular, right? So AutoFac or AutoMapper or redlock.nuts.strongname or StackExchange.redis, right? I can actually look and see which ones are compatible, which ones are incompatible. And if in some cases where they're compatible, what's the suggested replacement for them? I can then do the same thing. Like I can look at project references as well, which is pretty exciting. I can also then see all the different APIs that are leveraged inside of all the classes for these projects and take a look at if they're compatible or not. So for instance, StackExchange.redis multiplexer, right? So that is called in one source file and it's called twice. I can then drill into individual source files and see, hey, where are some of the changes that I'm going to need to make for my application? And I can click on that here. And then it shows me my code. It shows me this particular incompatible method invocation. In some cases, it'll say you'll need to go to this version of this NuGet package, right? So at the end of the day, it sets you up for success because it shows you all the different things that you're going to need to do to take an application from .NET Framework, in this case 4.5.1, all the way to .NET 6. And I can keep going on and on and on about all the different things we could do here, or I could just click this port button. I'm not going to do that because more than likely it's not going to work. However, let's take a look at an example of a project where I've already validated that if I just port it, it works. And I can take a look at my assess solutions and I can look at newtonsoft.json. If you're not familiar with newtonsoft.json, it is honestly the #1 package that's downloaded on NuGet, which is pretty crazy to think about. And what it basically does is it facilitates a mechanism for you to serialize and deserialize JSON. So objects to JSON, JSON to objects, and so on and so forth. And I grabbed an older version of this project, which is .NET 45, so .NET Framework 4.5. And inside of here, I can take a look at the projects, and I can look at all my project references. Like I mentioned, I can look at the APIs that are being called, and I can look at source files. But I can also just click this port button. This port does take a good amount of time in certain cases, so I did it right before this particular session. So let's actually, after we ported this to .NET 6, let's actually test and see what happens. So I'm up in Visual Studio 2022, and I'm just going to create a new project. So let's just create a new console application. So I'm going to call this console app 4 because naming is challenging, and I can specify long-term support or standard term support. So let's just go with 6.0 in this case, and then do create, and then it's going to spin up the .NET 6 console template, which if you haven't seen it, it does look a bit different than what we're accustomed to. There's no more program main, there's no curly braces, but all those things are included out, and I highly recommend you take a look at some of the release notes for .NET 6 as to why this is so cool. However, let's do this. So what I want to do is I want to add a reference to that project that I ported earlier today. So let's add an existing project. And I'm going to go over to Newtonsoft JSON ported and then open that up and then specify the particular class project. So if I open this class project up, which I can do in Visual Studio now, which is pretty cool, you can see that it's .NET 6.0. So what I want to be able to do is, let's just get out all this stuff. I want to just do a simple test. I want to basically take out an object, I want to serialize it as JSON, and then I want to write that output out to the console window. So how I would do that is just create a new list, and this list is a new list of strings. Let's just say it's foo and bar, right? So nothing exciting here, except I put a little typo. Don't worry about that. And then what I want to be able to do is I want to convert this particular this object that I've just instantiated into a string. And how I would do that is let's just go var JSON, and then let's just say that's JSON convert. And then a control dot to make sure that I get my usings, right? Whoops. Wrong one, add in soft.json. Okay. All right, so JSON convert dot serialize object, and then IntelliCode does the rest of the work for me. And then I'm going to write this out to the console, right? And then let's just do a console.read line. And then just to make sure that the deserialization works as well, let's just create a new list. And let's do JSON convert. And then we're going to deserialize that. And that's going to be a list of string JSON, right? So what's going on here, right? At a high level, I am taking a list that I created, and then I'm going to serialize that into a string representation, a JSON string representation of that object. I'm going to write that out to the console, and then I'm going to deserialize it back into a project or into an object. So if I hit this run button, what do you think is going to happen? It's just going to show a stringified version of that particular list of strings in the console window. So what's going on here? There we go. So as you can see, simple foo bar, right? So this is a string representation of that. And again, very, very simple demo of a very, very simple use case, but it shows you that you can take the porting assistant for .NET from AWS, and you can take a project, like in this particular case, noonsoft.json, and convert it from .NET Framework 4.5 to .NET 6 pretty quickly. And again, this is very much, your mileage may vary for all of these tools, but they're tools to help you be successful. So I just want to just call that out and say that you can use these tools to do that challenging thing of going from .NET Framework to .NET 6 or .NET 7. And that's kind of what I had for a presentation today. And this particular link, I'll put it in the chat as well. Put it in the chat as well. This basically has a link to a lot of stuff that I shared. So it has a link to the GitHub repository, it has a link to this particular slide deck. It has a link to the porting assistant and the upgrade assistant, their pages, as well as their GitHub repositories, and then some useful food for thought as it pertains to upgrading applications from .NET Framework to .NET 6 and 7. So hopefully it was helpful. I really enjoyed chatting with you folks. And yeah, if you have some questions or any feedback or anything, I'd love to hear it. But anyways, it was great chatting with you. So take care.
All right. Thank you, Isaac. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.